Chapter 10. Marooned. The Blue Jay was stuck fast. The boys tried to see what they had run into. Just beyond the bow, reeds whipped in the wind, and beyond that they thought they saw the dark shapes of trees. But even when they held the lanterns up, they couldn't see very much. "I hope the boat isn't damaged," Carl said worriedly. "We hit pretty hard." He hurried below deck with one of the lanterns to check for leaks. He returned a few minutes later with the comforting news that the bow was still watertight. They talked about going ashore, but quickly rejected the idea. They would probably have trouble getting the boat afloat in the morning, but at least they were safe here for the time being. After inspecting the boat once more, they decided to go back to bed. They were tired and couldn't do anything in this blackness anyway. They might as well sleep until daylight. After the excitement, Tom couldn't get back to sleep. He tossed and turned in bed, gripped by a vague sense of uneasiness. After a while, however, his eyes closed, and he too drifted off. He felt as if he had just gone to sleep when he was awakened by a noise. It was Bert. He was setting the table for breakfast. Then Tom saw that it was already light out. "I took a look outside," Bert said to him. "Would you like to guess where we ran aground?" Tom shook his head. "I figured we ran ashore somewhere." "Yes, I thought so too. But we didn't. We're stuck on an island in the middle of the lake." Tom's mouth dropped open in astonishment. He jumped out of bed and quickly started dressing. Carl, awakened by Tom's noise, soon followed his example. A moment later, they both climbed on deck. Bert was right. The Blue Jay had wedged its nose deep in the muddy bank of a small island that lay in the middle of the large lake. The water was still rough, but the wind wasn't blowing as hard as it had last night. The sky was heavily overcast. Shredded gray clouds scudded along the somber sky. "It doesn't look good," sighed Tom. "I'm afraid the boat is stuck solid." Tom and Carl jumped onto the island and explored it. There wasn't much to see on this small piece of land except reeds, bushes, and a few flimsy trees. As they crossed the island, they flushed out a few birds, but in a few moments they were standing on the other side, staring across the water. When they returned to the boat, Bert had calmly prepared breakfast. "Let's eat a little first," he suggested. "We'll never get the boat loose," cried Carl, "and we can't swim to shore either. It's much too far." "Well, then we have plenty of time for breakfast," Bert replied, unperturbed. "Things always look better on a full stomach." Carl was about to give an angry reply when he suddenly burst into laughter. "You're right, Bert. I didn't realize how hungry I was." While they ate, they considered various ideas to get themselves out of their fix. After breakfast, they stripped off their shoes and socks, and jumping into the shallow water, tried to push the boat out of the mud. No matter how hard they pushed, however, the boat didn't move a single centimeter. Discouraged, they finally gave up. "If only there were other boats around," said Bert. "Then we could call for help." Tom straightened up and scanned the deserted shores of the lake. He was mulling over a plan that had popped into his mind. "If I could swim to shore and get help from a couple of men with the boat, I bet we could pull it loose." "You'll never make it," cried Bert. "You'd be risking your life to try. It's much too far." "I think I can do it," argued Tom. "I'm the best swimmer. Besides, I can rest halfway there." He pointed to a dark spot between the island and shore, where a small patch of reeds rose from the water. "That must be a little island. If I swim to it and then stop and rest a while, I can make it to shore." His two friends continued to argue, insisting that it was too risky. At Carl's urging, they once more tried to push the boat free, but they couldn't budge it. They finally concluded that it was no use. Climbing back on board, they kept a watch for passing boats, but they spotted no signs of human life on or around the lake. After a while, Tom quietly went below and reappeared 2 minutes later, wearing only his swimming trunks. "I'm going," he said resolutely, "and I'm taking Scout with me, if that will make you feel any better. He can swim much farther than I can, and if I get into trouble, he can help me." Bert and Carl could see that Tom had made up his mind and did not try to dissuade him. "Are you coming, Scout? Let's swim to shore," Tom said. The German shepherd barked and wagged his tail. He seemed to understand what Tom was going to do, and when Tom jumped into the water, he jumped after him. I'll be back as soon as I find someone with a boat to help us. It might take a while, so don't worry if I'm not back right away, he called to his companions. Then he began the long swim to shore. The water was colder than he had expected. He had the impression that the lake was very deep, but he was not anxious. He was a good swimmer, and he would certainly be able to reach the little island. Beside him, Scout surged through the water like a dolphin. He could easily keep up to Tom. Tom set his course by a tall tree on shore. If he kept swimming in that direction, he should hit the island. When he thought he should be close to the island, he lifted his head above the water to look. The tree still lay ahead of him in the distance, but the island was nowhere to be seen. A paralyzing shock went through Tom. How had he gotten so far off course? He raised himself up even farther to look around. Then he spotted the island. It was much farther to his left than he had thought possible. He shook the water out of his eyes to take a better look. Then he saw what was the matter. What he had taken for an island was really a floating section of peat land topped by some reeds. The storm must have broken it loose last night. Even if he could reach it, he couldn't sit on it. Fear clawed at his throat. He turned his head and looked back at the boat. It lay far behind him, even farther away than shore. Should he swim back? If he couldn't make it, he could call for help. Carl and Bert could swim out to meet him and tow him in, if they heard him. Or was it better to keep swimming for shore? It looked a little closer, and perhaps the lake would get shallower close to shore so that he could walk the last part. Tom decided to try to reach land. He looked around once more. A prayer rose in his heart as he grimly set course for the distant shore. He swam very calmly and deliberately to save his strength. He made slow but steady progress. Scout stayed beside him. Gradually, exhaustion began setting in. Tom's arms and legs became heavier and heavier, and the cold seeped into his bones. Tom knew that he was fighting for his life. After a while, he thought he felt a current tugging at him, and when he glanced up at the shore, he was shocked to see that he had been carried off course. His brain worked quickly. If he swam with the current, he wouldn't have to work so hard, but then he would have to cover a much longer distance, and he was already exhausted. His only chance was to cut diagonally across the current to the nearest point of land. Again he resumed his struggle with the treacherous lake. He was panting and moaning with weariness. A cramp shot through his left leg, so he stopped swimming until it pulled out. Then he started again. He won a few more meters. The shore was drawing closer, but he felt as if all his strength were gone. He closed his eyes and floated with the current. A pleasant, peaceful sensation washed over him. When he looked up half a minute later, however, a spasm of fear went through him. He had drifted an alarming distance. Again, his arms and legs mechanically went to work, but he made agonizing progress. Every stroke took his total effort. Desperately, he splashed on, but an invisible hand seemed to be pulling him down. His head slid under the surface. He began to cry out, but water filled his mouth. Coughing and gasping, he shot to the surface again. Suddenly, Scout was beside him. His teeth seized Tom's hair, holding his head above water. Calling on all the strength in his powerful legs, the German shepherd swam for shore, pulling his master with him. Tom allowed himself to be towed. After a minute, he recovered sufficiently to tread water with his feet to help Scout along. Suddenly, he thought he felt something underfoot. He reached down, and his toes touched bottom. Land had never felt so good to him. He had made it. Standing up, he saw that the water was only up to his chest. Shivering with cold, exhaustion, and emotion, he waded to shore. Scout had to swim a little farther, but soon he too could walk. When they reached dry land, Tom sank to the ground. Everything began to spin before his eyes, and for a moment he thought he was going to pass out. He stretched out on the ground and closed his eyes until the dizziness passed. Scout had taken the swim in stride as if it were nothing unusual. He shook himself off, spraying water in all directions, and then lay down beside his master. After a while, Tom felt warmer and lighter. When he opened his eyes, he saw that the sun had broken through the clouds. He soaked up the warmth with a feeling of well-being. Finally, he sat up, and only then did he begin to realize how close he had come to drowning. He bowed his head and thanked God for helping him. Then he looked out over the lake. It looked much more cheerful with the sun glittering on the surface, but he had felt its treacherous power. In the distance, he could make out the boat, but he couldn't see his friends. Now he had to find help as quickly as possible. His friends were still in trouble, and they were counting on him.